The letter hit Caleb Hart square in the chest like a fist from God, tumbling end over end across the flat Kansas prairie on a warm September morning in 1873, and he caught it purely out of reflex before it could sail past him and disappear into the endless yellow grass. He sat atop his roan mare, Duchess, somewhere between Dodge City and absolutely nowhere, having just delivered a small herd of longhorns to the stockyards and found himself with 3 weeks and no particular direction to ride. He was 26 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that had known nothing but rope and leather since he was 14, and he was, in every meaningful sense of the word, alone. Not the kind of alone that comes from an empty room or a quiet evening. The kind that settles into a man's bones and stays there, quiet and permanent, like old winter frost that the spring can never quite reach. He looked at the letter for a long moment before he let himself read it. The envelope was already opened, the seal broken cleanly, as though someone had read it and then simply let it go. Or perhaps it had been torn from a saddlebag, or tumbled from a wagon. The paper inside was cream-colored and small, written in a woman's hand. The ink faded slightly at the edges but still perfectly readable. Caleb glanced across the empty prairie in all directions, seeing nothing but swaying grass and the occasional hawk circling high above the pale blue sky. He unfolded the letter. It read, "To whoever finds this, or to no one at all, I am writing because I have no one to write to and I cannot keep these words inside me any longer. My name is Elara Voss. I am 23 years old. I came west from Philadelphia 2 years ago when my father's debts forced the sale of everything we owned, and I have been living in the town of Millhaven, Kansas, working as a seamstress for the widow Hutchins. I do not complain about my work. I am grateful for it. But I confess in this letter that no one may ever read that I am desperately lonely, not for a city or fine things, only for someone who sees me. Someone who might sit across a supper table and tell me something real about their day and listen when I tell them something real about mine. I want to see the stars from somewhere other than this window. I want to know what it feels like to be chosen. My father says I am fanciful. Perhaps I am. But I think a person ought to be allowed to want one true thing, even if the wanting never amounts to anything at all. If you have read this, stranger, I hope you have someone who chooses you. I hope the prairie is wide enough for whatever you are looking for. Sincerely, Elara Voss, Millhaven, Kansas." Caleb read the letter twice, then a third time. He sat there on Duchess for a long while, the September wind moving through the grass around him in long silver waves, and he felt something shift inside his chest that he had no honest name for. It was not pity. He was certain of that. He had no patience for pity as an emotion, having received too much of it growing up as an orphan in a cattle town. It was something closer to recognition. The feeling of reading a sentence in a book and thinking, without being able to explain why, that someone wrote that directly for you. He refolded the letter carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of his worn canvas jacket, directly against his heart, where it pressed gently with every breath he took. He turned Duchess around. Millhaven was not on any map he carried, but he had heard the name once from a freighter at a trading post outside of Dodge, who had mentioned it as a small settlement growing up around a creek crossing about 70 miles east-southeast of his current position. That was on horseback across open prairie, the better part of 2.5 days of hard riding. 3, if the weather turned or the creek crossings ran high from the early autumn rains. Caleb Hart had nowhere else to be and nothing pressing to ride toward. But he did not think of it that way as he turned Duchess's nose toward the southeast and pressed her into an easy, ground-eating lope. He thought of it the way a compass needle must feel when it finally swings true north. Something in him had oriented, quietly and without fanfare, and he was moving toward it before he had consciously decided to go. The first day of riding was golden and warm. The Kansas prairie in September sits in a kind of borrowed beauty, the grasses having turned from green to gold and amber, the sky so wide and blue it looks like something painted rather than real. Caleb rode steadily, resting Duchess during the worst heat of the afternoon near a shallow stream lined with cottonwoods whose leaves were just beginning to yellow at the edges. He ate a cold biscuit from his saddlebag and drank from his canteen and thought about the letter. He thought about the line that had snagged him most deeply. "I want to know what it feels like to be chosen." He had turned that over in his mind a dozen times already, the way you work a pebble with your thumb, feeling its edges. There was no self-pity in the line, he decided. It was stated simply, like a fact about weather or terrain. She was not asking for sympathy. She was saying something true out loud into the prairie wind, because it needed to be said somewhere even if no one heard it. He pulled the letter out and read it again in the cottonwood shade, Duchess cropping grass nearby, the creek making its soft, indifferent sound over the stones. He put it away and rode on. The second day brought clouds rolling in from the northwest, low and gray-bellied, carrying the smell of rain. The temperature dropped 20 degrees by mid-morning and Caleb pulled on his heavier jacket, the one lined with wool that he had bought in Abilene 2 winters past. The prairie under clouds looked different than it did under sun. Older, more serious. The grass moved in harder gusts, and the horizon closed itself off with curtains of silver where the rain was already falling somewhere distant. He crossed a wide, shallow river at a gravel ford near midday, water coming up to Duchess's belly, cold and clear, and on the far bank he found a wagon trail heading east that made his progress easier. The trail was rutted from summer traffic, dried hard, and he followed it through the afternoon as the clouds built and darkened without quite breaking open. He camped that night in a shallow draw where the land dipped down enough to block the worst of the wind. Making a small fire from dead wood he gathered along the draw's banks, cooking a can of beans he had brought from his saddlebag. He sat with his back against his saddle and looked up at the narrow strip of cloudy sky visible above the draw's edges, and he thought about what he was doing in the honest, clear-eyed way he preferred to think about things. He was riding 3 days across open prairie to find a woman he had never met, based on a letter she had written to no one, that had blown across the grassland and struck him in the chest. By any reasonable accounting, it was an absurd thing to do. But Caleb had spent 12 years being reasonable. He had been reasonable when he took his first job as a 14-year-old wrangler because it was the only work available. He had been reasonable when he stayed on with various cattle operations year after year, saving money carefully and spending it more carefully, never putting down roots because roots required a place and a reason, and he had found himself short of both. He had been reasonable right up, until the moment a piece of cream-colored paper had sailed out of the wide Kansas sky and pressed itself against his chest with all the insistence of an unanswered question. The night was cold. He pulled his bedroll tight and listened to the wind moving over the draw above him, and before he slept he pressed his hand briefly against the breast pocket of his jacket, feeling the paper there, thin and real. He was up before dawn. The third day of riding brought the rain, arriving at first as a light mist that softened the world and made the grass smell green again despite the season, and then building through the morning into a steady, serious downpour that drummed on his hat brim and ran in rivulets off Duchess's flanks. He kept her moving. She was a good horse, solid and even-tempered, and she leaned into the rain without complaint. He found Millhaven in the late afternoon when the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the low sun was cutting through the breaking clouds from the west, laying long golden bars across the wet prairie. The town appeared first as a water tower, then as a church steeple, then as a collection of raw lumber buildings arranged along a wide dirt main street that was currently running with brown water from the rain. There were perhaps 24 structures in total: a general store, a saloon, a livery, a post office, a small frame church, and a scatter of houses and outbuildings beyond the main street. It was a real town, solid and working, not just a collection of tents. It had the look of a place that intended to stay. Caleb rode Duchess into the livery stable at the edge of town, and arranged for her feed and stabling with a boy of about 15 who wore his hair plastered flat by the rain and regarded Caleb with the calm, assessing eye of someone who has seen many strangers come through and learned to read them quickly. "I am looking for a woman named Alara Voss," Caleb said, keeping his voice easy and neutral. "She works as a seamstress, I believe." "For a widow by the name of Hutchins." The boy pointed down the main street without hesitation. "Hutchins' place is the blue house at the south end of Main, past the general store. Miss Voss lives in the back room, does sewing there." He paused and then added with the frank curiosity of youth, "You a relation of hers?" "No," Caleb said, paying for the stable. The boy looked at him for another moment. "She is a real nice lady," he offered, as though that information might be relevant. "I expect she is," Caleb said. He walked down the muddy main street of Millhaven in the evening light, his boots sinking slightly with each step, his hat still dripping at the brim, carrying nothing but the letter in his breast pocket and what he recognized, clearly and without melodrama, as the most significant nervousness he had felt in his adult life. He was not a man who was frequently nervous. He had ridden into cattle operations as a stranger and talked his way into employment. He had handled spooked horses and difficult men. He had once sat across a table from a cattle baron in Abilene who was known for his short temper and his long memory, and negotiated a fair wage without flinching. But this was entirely different territory. The blue house at the south end of Main Street was a modest, neat building with a small covered porch and a front window through which the warm yellow light of a lamp showed against the gray evening. There was a smaller side door that likely led to the room the boy had mentioned, and beside the front door hung a small painted sign that read, "Hutchins Dry Goods and Fine Sewing." Caleb stood on the board sidewalk in front of the house for a moment that lasted longer than he would later admit to anyone, rain dripping quietly from the porch eave, and then he stepped up onto the porch and knocked. The woman who opened the door was not Alara Voss. She was perhaps 60, round-faced and sharp-eyed, wearing a dark dress and an expression that suggested she had been interrupted at something important and was prepared to forgive it, but only just barely. "Mrs. Hutchins," Caleb said, removing his hat. "I am," she said. Her eyes moved over him with the swift efficiency of a woman who has assessed men at her doorstep before and made good decisions on the basis of it. "You are soaking wet and tracking mud. What can I do for you?" "I am looking for Miss Alara Voss," he said. "I have something of hers, something I found on the prairie." He reached into his breast pocket and held up the letter, slightly damp from the rain but whole. "I wanted to return it to her directly." Mrs. Hutchins looked at the letter. Something in her expression shifted subtly from assessment to something more complicated. "You rode here from the prairie to return a letter," she said. It was not quite a question. 3 days, he said. She studied him for another long moment. Then she said, "Wait here," and disappeared back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. He could hear voices inside, low and indistinct, and then a pause, and then movement, and then the door opened wider and she was there. He knew her immediately, which made no logical sense because he had never seen her before in his life. But the letter had given him something of her, the clarity and honesty of her words, the precise way she had said things that most people would not say out loud, and he recognized the person standing in the doorway the way you recognize a piece of music you have heard only once but never forgotten. Alara Voss was tall for a woman of her era, with dark brown hair pinned up but coming loose at the temples from a day's work, and eyes that were a shade of gray-green that Caleb had never seen before and would spend considerable time afterward trying to find adequate words for. She was wearing a simple dark green dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a pincushion still strapped to her left wrist, a detail that told him she had come directly from her work. Her face was open and serious, and at the moment thoroughly startled. She looked at the letter he was still holding. Then she looked at him. "Where did you find that?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than he expected, given the color rising in her cheeks. "About 70 miles west-northwest of here," he said. "On the open prairie. It was blowing across the grass. I caught it. He held it out to her. "My name is Caleb Hart. I am a cattle hand working out of Dodge currently." I read the letter. I know I should not have, but it was already open and I did not know what it was until I had read several lines, and by then, he stopped, because that was not quite honest and he had made himself a rule about honesty. And by then I had read all of it. She took the letter from him carefully. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment without opening it, as if confirming to herself that it was real. "I wrote this 4 months ago," she said quietly. "I found it this week," he said. "I sent it nowhere," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite embarrassment and not quite wonder. "I could not think who to send it to. I thought if I let it go on the prairie, at least it would go somewhere. At least it would be moving." She paused. "I did not genuinely believe anyone would read it." "I read it," Caleb said, "and I came." She looked up at him then, really looked at him with those gray-green eyes that did not flinch away, and he held her gaze steadily because it seemed important not to flinch either. "You rode 3 days," she said slowly. "I did." "Why?" It was the only question that mattered, and he had been working out the answer for 3 days of riding, through sun and cloud and rain, and what he had arrived at was the truth, which was both simpler and more terrifying than any elaborate explanation would have been. "Because you said something true," he said. "And the people who say true things are rare enough that when you find them, even on the wind on the open prairie, it seems foolish to ride the other direction." The porch was quiet except for the drip of rain from the eave. Mrs. Hutchins, he noticed, had retreated fully inside and tactfully left the door slightly ajar, a level of social management that he suspected she was rather practiced at. Ilara Voss looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You are still dripping on the porch." "I am," he agreed. "You should come inside and have some coffee," she said, and stepped back from the door. He followed her in. The front room of the Hutchins house was warm and low-ceilinged, cluttered in a way that felt lived in rather than neglected, bolts of fabric stacked against one wall, a large table covered with cut pieces of a dress in progress, oil lamps casting amber light over everything. Mrs. Hutchins was already at the kitchen stove, efficiently not looking at them, making the particular kind of not looking that is its own form of attention. Ilara led Caleb to a pair of chairs near the stone fireplace, where a small fire was burning against the cool of the rain-wet evening. She sat across from him with the letter in her lap and her hands folded over it, and he sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his hat between his hands, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which was comfortable rather than awkward. That, he would think later, was the first sign of something significant. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Hart," she said. Not as social obligation, but with genuine directness, as if she had already decided to skip the usual preamble and go straight to the question. "Caleb," he said, "please." He thought about where to start and decided that honesty had served him once already today and there was no reason to abandon it. "I grew up in a cattle town in Texas. My parents died of fever when I was 14. I have been working cattle drives and ranch hands work since then. I am 26. I have no permanent address and no land of my own, though I have some savings set by. I am good with horses and reasonably good with most other things that require patience and attention. I am not particularly social, but I am not unfriendly either." He paused. "I have never done anything quite like this before." "That makes 2 of us," she said quietly, and something in her voice relaxed slightly, like a shoulder coming down from a position of held tension. "I came west with my father 2 years ago. He is in Abilene now, working for a freighting company. We are not estranged exactly, but we are not close. He is a practical man who finds she glanced at the letter, he finds what he calls my fanciful nature to be somewhat inconvenient." "He is wrong," Caleb said simply. She looked at him. "You are certain of that?" "A person who can write what you wrote in that letter is not fanciful," he said. "They are honest. Those are not the same thing." Mrs. Hutchins arrived with 2 cups of coffee, set them down without comment, and went back to the kitchen with a discretion that Caleb decided he thoroughly appreciated. Alara wrapped both hands around her cup and looked into it for a moment. "You said you read the letter 3 times," she said. "I did not say that." "No," she agreed. "But you read it more than once, I think, or you would not have remembered it well enough to come." "3 times on the first day," he said, "twice more after that." She looked up at him with an expression he could not fully read, something complicated and somewhat undefended. "What was it that made you come?" she asked, and he could tell she was asking something real, not making conversation. "The line about being chosen," he said. "I know what it feels like to not be chosen. An orphan on a cattle drive is not chosen. He is tolerated, which is a different thing entirely. You wrote it without asking anyone to feel sorry for you and without pretending you did not feel it. That is a rare kind of courage." The fire crackled between them. Rain tapped at the window. From the kitchen came the quiet, domestic sound of Mrs. Hutchins going about her business. "You are not what I expected," Alara said. "You did not expect anyone," he pointed out. "No," she said, and laughed briefly. And it was a real laugh, not the careful social laugh of a woman in company, but the surprised, genuine kind that happens when something strikes you as funny before you can decide whether to be reserved about it. It changed her face entirely, opened it like a window. He thought, there it is. They talked for 2 hours. He learned that she had grown up in Philadelphia in a household that had once been comfortable. Her mother's death when Alara was 16 having taken with it much of the warmth, her father's subsequent business failures having taken the rest. She had come west not entirely willingly, but had found, to her own surprise, that she did not miss Philadelphia as much as she had expected. What she missed was conversation. Her work for Mrs. Hutchins was good and honest, and she was grateful for it. But Mrs. Hutchins, however kind in her ways, was not a great talker, and the social world of Millhaven, small and still forming itself, had not yet provided her with the kind of friendship she had hoped for. She was learning, she told him, to find satisfaction in small pleasures. The quality of light on the prairie in early morning. The way a piece of fabric came together when the cut was exactly right. The sound of the creek that ran at the edge of town. But she found these things most beautiful when she imagined having someone to point them out to, which was the specific loneliness of a person built for sharing things. He told her about cattle drives that stretched 4 months from Texas to the railheads, the particular quality of silence on the open plains under a billion stars, the way a herd of cattle moving together sounds like the earth itself breathing. He told her about the loyalty of good horses and the comedy of bad ones. He told her about the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 12 years, shaped differently than hers but recognizable to him when he read it in her words, a loneliness born not of any particular suffering, but of the simple, persistent absence of someone who knew you. Mrs. Hutchins appeared at 9 o'clock to inform them that she was going to bed, and that Mr. Hart was welcome to the spare cot in the storage room given the lateness of the hour and the wet weather, a offer she made with perfect matter-of-fact decency that closed off any possible awkwardness about the situation before it could form. Caleb accepted with genuine gratitude. Before he retired to the storage room, which was small and smelled pleasantly of cedar and dried herbs, and contained a cot that was the most comfortable surface he had slept on in 3 days, he stood at the door of the front room where Alara was clearing away the coffee cups, and he said, "I would like to call on you tomorrow, if that is agreeable." She turned and looked at him with that direct, unguarded look that he was already beginning to think of as particularly hers. "Where else would you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said honestly. "Then I will see you tomorrow, Caleb," she said. He lay on the cot in the dark cedar-smelling storage room with his hands behind his head and looked at the ceiling and felt something in him that was so unfamiliar it took him a while to identify it correctly. It was not contentment exactly, because contentment is quiet and this was not quiet. It was more like the feeling of arriving at a place you have been traveling toward without knowing it, the specific, startling recognition of, "Oh, here. This is it. This is the place." He slept more deeply than he had slept in months. In the morning he woke to gray light and the smell of coffee and bacon from the kitchen, and he came out to find Mrs. Hutchins at the stove and Alara already at her sewing table, working on a shirt that she held up when he entered and said, "Good morning. Do you know your collar size?" He blinked at her. "You are in need of a clean shirt," she said, "and I happen to make them, collar size." He told her and she nodded and went back to her stitching, and Mrs. Hutchins put a plate in front of him without being asked and said, "Sit down and eat before you fall over." And Caleb sat at the kitchen table and ate and felt, again, that peculiar sensation of having arrived somewhere. After breakfast he asked if he could be useful, and was put to work splitting firewood in the yard behind the house, which was wet from the rain but clear and cool and bright with morning light. He worked steadily for 2 hours, building up a proper stack under the lean-to at the back of the property. And when he came inside, Alara was standing at the back door watching him with the specific thoughtful expression of a person, observing something they were deciding how to feel about. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He came up the steps and stopped at the door, close enough now that he could see the green-gray of her eyes very clearly. "But I have been living on cattle outfits for 12 years where the rule is you earn your place by the work you do, and that seems like a reasonable rule for most situations." "It is a good rule," she said. "Can I walk with you today?" he asked. "If you have time, if you need errands done or anything that takes you out of the house." She considered him. "I need to deliver a finished dress to Mrs. Patterson on the north side of town," she said, "and I was going to walk to the creek this afternoon. I usually do on my free afternoons. Then I will carry the dress," he said, "and walk to the creek." She smiled, and again it was the real kind, and again it changed everything. They walked to Mrs. Patterson's first, Caleb carrying the carefully folded dress in its brown paper wrapping, and Alara introduced him without any particular elaboration as a friend who is passing through and was kind enough to carry my package, which was both technically accurate and somehow entirely insufficient as a description. Mrs. Patterson, a broad, cheerful woman of middle age, looked at Caleb with frank interest and said, "You should come to the church supper Saturday. They always need extra hands for the tables." Caleb said he would be glad to. He had no plan to leave by Saturday. He was not certain, standing on Mrs. Patterson's front step in the September morning light when he had decided that. But he was not in any hurry to examine the decision closely. They walked to the creek in the afternoon. It was a proper Kansas creek, not large, running clean and quick over a bed of smooth stones, lined on both banks with cottonwoods and willows that were beginning to color. Alara led him to a particular spot where a large flat stone sat at the water's edge, clearly used before, and they sat there in the cool shade and watched the water. "I come here when the work gets heavy," she said. "Not the sewing, the other kind of heavy. The kind that comes from too much quiet and not enough of the right kind of talking." "I understand that kind of heavy," he said. They were quiet for a while, a comfortable quiet, the creek doing all the necessary talking. "Tell me something true," she said, and he recognized the echo of her own letter's language and felt it land in him like a warm coal. He thought about it carefully. "When I caught your letter on the prairie and read it," he said, "the first thing I felt was that I knew you, not as a thought, just as a feeling, like recognizing a piece of music. I have never had that feeling before, meeting another person. I have never ridden 3 days on the strength of a feeling before either." He paused. "I do not know what to make of that yet, but it seems important to say it out loud." She was looking at the creek while he spoke, and she kept looking at it for a moment after he finished. Then she said, without turning, "When Mrs. Hutchins told me there was a man at the door who had ridden 3 days to bring me a letter I had thrown to the wind, I thought she was joking. And then I thought she was confused. And then I thought, if this is real, then it is possibly the strangest and most," she hesitated, "most remarkable thing that has ever happened to me." "Is it real?" he asked. She turned and looked at him fully. "You are here," she said. "So yes, I think it is." The days that followed built themselves quietly and solidly, the way good things tend to, without fanfare, one thing following naturally from the next. Caleb had ridden into Millhaven with no plan beyond delivering a letter, and had found himself, with no particular decision having been made, embedded in the daily life of the town. He took a room at the boarding house run by a man named Doyle, which cost him 50 cents a day and included a bed and 2 meals and access to a shared washroom. And in exchange for a reduced rate, he helped Doyle with the heavier maintenance tasks around the property, replacing a broken porch railing and mending a gate and rehanging a barn door that had been sitting wrong on its hinges. He spent his mornings working for his keep at the boarding house and his afternoons finding reasons to be near the Hutchins house. He was honest with himself about what he was doing, because honesty was the one practice he maintained rigorously. He was courting Elara Voss. He was doing it without a formal declaration, without calling on her father to ask permission in the traditional way, partly because her father was in Abilene, and partly because Elara was 23 years old and had been managing her own life for long enough that he suspected she would prefer to be consulted directly. He was doing it by being present and useful and honest in himself, which was the only way he knew to do anything. She came to the boarding house porch one evening with a shirt, the one she had been working on that first morning, finished now, and she handed it to him with the direct practicality she brought to most things and said, "Try it on and tell me if anything fits wrong." He changed in the room and came back, and she walked around him once, tugging a seam here and pressing a collar there, her hands quick and precise and professional, and then she stepped back and looked at him with her head tilted and said, "Good. The shoulders are right. You are very good at this," he said. "I have had good teachers and a great deal of practice," she said. Then more quietly, "I made my mother's burial dress when I was 16. The seamstress could not come in time. My hands did not shake once." She said it plainly, a fact rather than a bid for sympathy, and he received it the same way. "That was brave," he said. "It needed doing," she said, which was exactly the same thing. He paid her what the shirt was worth, which she tried to refuse and he insisted on, and they stood on the boarding house porch in the evening light and argued about it in a way that was not really an argument at all, but something more like the pleasant friction of two people establishing how they move around each other, where the sharp edges are and where the smooth ones are. She kept the money. He kept the shirt. He wore it to the church supper on Saturday, which was held in the small frame building that served as both the Methodist chapel and the town's principal gathering space. The whole of Millhaven's population seemed to be in attendance, perhaps 60 or 70 people ranging from old-timers who had come west with the first wave to young families who had arrived in the past year with wagons full of hope, and the particular kind of stubbornness that the frontier tends to either reward or break. Caleb helped set up tables and carry dishes, as Mrs. Patterson had suggested he would, and discovered that he was good at making himself useful in social situations in a way that required no actual socializing, a skill he had developed on cattle drives where the crew was a small society requiring management. He moved efficiently and pleasantly and spoke when spoken to, and gave no one cause to notice him too much. Elara sat with Mrs. Hutchins at a long table and talked to neighbors and watched him across the room with an expression he was beginning to read as particular to her. He read it as something like, "I am paying close attention to you and drawing conclusions." After supper, there was fiddle music and the tables were pushed back, and people danced on the board floor with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a community that has been working hard all week and is grateful for an excuse to move. Caleb did not dance, not because he could not, but because he had not in a long time and was uncertain of his recollection. But he stood near the wall and watched, and when Elara appeared at his elbow he looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Can you dance?" she asked. "After a fashion," he said. "The fiddle player is going to play something slower next," she said. "I can tell because he switches how he holds his bow." She paused, and in the lamplight her face was warm and a little flushed from the evening's company. "Will you dance with me after a fashion?" He held out his hand. The fiddle player did indeed shift to something slower. A waltz played with a slight prairie swing to it that was not quite what they taught in Philadelphia drawing rooms but was its own thing, rooted and true. He turned out to remember dancing better than he had feared. She followed easily and well, and they moved together on the crowded floor with a naturalness that he noticed and she noticed, and that several of the neighboring couples noticed and exchanged small, quiet looks about. "You lied about after a fashion," she said. "I honestly was not sure I remembered," he said. She was close enough now that he could smell the particular warmth of her hair, something like lavender and clean cotton, and he kept his hand steady on her back and his eyes steady on her face and felt the floor very solidly beneath his feet and the world very clearly around him. "I have not danced since," he thought, 1869, in Ellsworth, at a cattle drive celebration. "That was 4 years ago," she said. "It was," he said. "Things come back." "Some things do," she agreed, and there was something layered in the way she said it that made him look at her more carefully. She looked back, equally carefully, equally directly, and they were dancing slowly in a church hall in Millhaven, Kansas, in September of 1873, surrounded by their neighbors for the moment, and something between them had quietly and irrevocably shifted from possibility into something considerably more definite. He walked her home after, he and Mrs. Hutchins both, through a night that had gone clear and cold, the stars extraordinary overhead, the Milky Way so dense and bright it seemed to generate its own soft light over the dark prairie. Mrs. Hutchins, with consistent and elegant tact, walked slightly ahead and left them a few paces of privacy, and Alara and Caleb walked side by side, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, the gravel of the main street crunching under their feet. "I keep thinking," Alara said quietly, "about what it means that you came, not the practical part, the other part." "What other part?" "The part where I wrote that letter honestly without expecting anything to come of it," she said, "and something came of it anyway, as if the prairie decided to answer me." "The prairie is large," he said. "It holds a great many things." "It held you," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too, turning to face him on the empty street, Mrs. Hutchins having tactfully gained considerable distance ahead. The stars were enormous overhead and the night was cold and the town was quiet. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I came here not knowing what I expected," he said. "I told myself it was to return your letter, which was true enough. But I think what I was really doing was answering you. The way you answer when someone says something that deserves an answer." He looked at her directly. "I do not want to be passing through, Alara. I want to know if you would be willing to let me stay a while." She was quiet for a moment and he waited, which was easy because he had learned patience the way most cowboys learn it, from long hours and long distances and the understanding that rushing things that need to settle rarely ends well. "I do not know you very well yet," she said. "No," he agreed. "I know that. But I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to. Know you, I mean." She paused. "Stay." It was one word, but it was sufficient. He stayed. October came to Millhaven with a sharpening of the air and a deepening of the gold in the cottonwoods along the creek, and Caleb found himself, for the first time in his adult life, building something in a particular place rather than moving through it. He spoke to a rancher named Theodore Graves, who operated a modest cattle outfit 6 miles outside of town, who had been looking for an experienced hand, who could also do some breaking work on a string of young horses he had picked up from a southern breeder. Caleb was experienced at both and took the position readily, which gave him regular wages, a legitimate reason to be in the area, and the daily satisfaction of work he was genuinely good at. He rode out to Graves's ranch each morning on Dutchess and came back to town each evening, stopping at the boarding house to wash and change, and then finding his way, naturally, reliably, to the Hutchins house, where he and Alara had fallen into the habit of spending the hour or two before supper in the front room or on the porch, talking and not talking in equal measure, which was, in his estimation, the best possible arrangement for two people building toward something real. He found himself telling her things he had told no one else, not because he had kept them deliberately secret, but because there had simply never before been anyone who both invited honesty and received it without making it into something to be managed. He told her about the fever that had taken his parents, the particular horror of a 14-year-old watching a crisis unfold without the tools to address it. He told her about the foreman on his first cattle drive who had been hard and fair in equal measure, and who was probably, if Caleb was honest, the closest thing he had had to a mentor in his life. He told her about the loneliness that had been his background noise for 12 years, not dramatic but constant, like whether you have lived in so long you have forgotten what the other kind feels like. She listened to all of it with complete attention and without performing sympathy, which is to say she received it the way it was offered, simply and directly, and responded in kind. She told him about her mother in ways she had not told other people, not the fact of her death but the texture of who she had been, a woman who loved beautiful fabrics and bad poetry and the smell of rain, who had taught Alara to sew not as a practical skill, but as a form of attention, the idea being that making a thing carefully is a way of honoring both the thing and the person it is for. She told him about the slow unwinding of her father's optimism in the years after her mother's death, how practical grief had replaced emotional grief in him until he had become, not a bad man, but a smaller one, contracted, interested primarily in the next calculation. She told him about leaving Philadelphia in a wagon with a suitcase and a sewing kit, and the specific terror and exhilaration of a wide-open country that did not know or care what her family had once been. They were sitting on the porch one evening in mid-October, the night air sharp with the first real cold of the season, both of them bundled against it, when she said abruptly, "My father is coming to Millhaven next month. He has business with the freighting office here." She said it in a neutral voice that was not quite neutral enough to be as neutral as she intended. "Are you glad?" he asked. "I am not sure," she said. "We have not seen each other in 6 months. He writes practical letters. He asks practical questions. When he is here he will make assessments." She paused. "He will assess you." "He is welcome to," Caleb said. She looked at him sideways. "He will not think you are a sufficient prospect," she said, with a directness that might have been alarming but that he received as exactly what it was, a warning offered honestly because she respected him enough to give it. "He values property and position. You are a hired hand with savings and a good horse." "He is not wrong that I am a hired hand with savings and a good horse," Caleb said. "Those are accurate facts." "He will miss the other things," she said. "Most people miss the other things," he said. "That does not mean the other things are not there." She was quiet for a moment. "You are not worried," she said, as though this were mildly remarkable. "I am not what your father wants for you, if what your father wants is land and position," he said. "But I am something else, and I think I am the thing you actually want, and between the two of us, it seems to me that your preference is the one that matters most." He paused. "You are 23 years old and you have been managing your own life for 2 years in a frontier town. The decision is yours to make." She looked at him for a long time. "You are the most honest person I have ever met," she said. "I find it more efficient than the alternative," he said, and she laughed, that real surprised laugh that he had been cataloging and treasuring, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was the closest they had been to one another physically since the dance, and which he felt with remarkable clarity through the wool of his jacket and into the bone. When she straightened, she did not move away very far. He left his arm where it was, loosely around her shoulders, and she let it stay there, and they sat like that looking at the cold October stars over Millhaven, and he thought, "I am going to ask her to marry me. Not today. Not yet. But I am going to." He bought a ring from the general store in early November. It was not a grand ring, because the general store in Millhaven was not in the business of grandeur, But it was a proper ring, a thin gold band with a small inset turquoise stone that caught the light in a way he liked, because it reminded him of the color of the sky over the prairie on a clear morning. He kept it in his jacket pocket and went on working at Graves's ranch and spending his evenings with Alara and waiting for the right moment, which he was in no particular hurry to rush. Her father arrived in the second week of November. His name was Frederick Voss, and he was 54 years old, a compact, precise man who wore his disappointments like a well-fitted suit, close against his body, tailored to a shape he had inhabited for so long he no longer noticed it. He shook Caleb's hand on the porch of the Hutchins house with a firm grip and eyes that measured efficiently and reported their findings without expression. Supper that evening was at Mrs. Hutchins's table, which Mrs. Hutchins had set formally with her good dishes and a centerpiece of dried prairie flowers in a mason jar, a combination that was somehow exactly right. Frederick Voss talked about the freighting business in Abilene, the state of the railroad, the future of Kansas commerce. He asked Caleb precise questions about his work at Graves's ranch, his background in the cattle trade, his plans. He asked all of this with the manner of a man conducting an interview rather than having a conversation, and Caleb answered all of it directly and without embellishment. "You have no property," Frederick said, midway through the meal. It was not a question. "No, sir," Caleb said, "not currently. No land, no house, no established business." "No," Caleb said. "What I have is 12 years of reliable work, a solid knowledge of horses and cattle, a good reputation among the people I have worked for, and the intention to build something permanent." He paused and let that sit for a moment. "I realize that is less concrete than the alternative." Frederick Voss cut a piece of meat with precise economic movements. "My daughter deserves security," he said. "She does," Caleb agreed readily. "She deserves a great many things. Security, yes. But also someone who actually sees her, which is the thing she said she wanted, and the thing I intend to provide." He said it without aggression and without apology, which was the only register he had for this kind of statement. "I expect we disagree about which of those is harder to find." Frederick looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Alara, who had been sitting across the table with the specific composed expression of a woman waiting to see what the men in her life would decide about her before she corrected them. "What do you want, Alara?" Frederick asked, and it seemed to cost him something to ask it, or perhaps it was just that he was not accustomed to asking it. "I want what I have been building here," she said, with perfect steadiness. "My work, this town, and Caleb." She looked at her father with clear, kind, unapologetic eyes. "I have made my own life here, Father. I am grateful for your concern, but this is mine to decide." A long pause. "You are your mother's daughter," Frederick Voss said finally. It landed between criticism and compliment and settled after a moment into compliment. "Yes," Alara said, "I am." Caleb asked her 2 evenings later, on the flat stone by the creek, in the last amber light of a November afternoon that was cold enough to see their breath but still and clear and beautiful. He had not rehearsed it because rehearsed proposals felt dishonest to him, so he simply said it the way he said most things, directly and with the full weight of what he meant behind it. "I came 3 days across the prairie to bring you back your letter," he said, "and I found something I had not known I was looking for. I know you. Not everything, but enough to know that the rest is something I want to spend time finding out." He reached into his pocket and took out the ring. The turquoise stone caught the last of the light. "Alara Voss, will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, then at him. Then at the creek briefly, in the way she did when she was thinking something through honestly rather than reacting to it. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she said most things, directly and without decoration. And then she held out her left hand and he put the ring on her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her, which was luck or something better than luck, and she looked at it on her hand for a moment before she looked up at him. He kissed her then, for the first time, there on the flat stone by the winter-quiet creek, in the cold November air with the cottonwoods gone bare above them, and the sky going from gold to pink to deep cold blue overhead. And it was the kind of kiss that has nothing performative in it. Only the simple, profound rightness of two people who have been moving toward each other from a long distance, finally arriving in the same place at the same time. They married in December in the small Methodist church in Millhaven, before the full population of the town and Frederick Voss, who had decided to extend his stay after the supper table conversation, and had spent the intervening weeks being, if not enthusiastic, at least present and gradually less opposed. He gave Alara away with the formal dignity of a man doing his best within the limits of his nature, and when he shook Caleb's hand afterward, he held it a moment longer than he needed to and said quietly, "Take care of her," with a gravity that told Caleb he meant it as the most serious thing he had said in years. "I will," Caleb said. "You have my word." The ceremony was simple, and the celebration afterward was generous and warm, the town having taken some proprietary interest in the union, given that it had formed partly in their midst. Mrs. Hutchins made a cake using the last of her good sugar. The fiddle player from the church supper played, and people danced on the church floor again with the same uncomplicated pleasure they had brought to it in September. And Caleb and Alara danced together much more than after a fashion, comfortable now, easy in each other's space, her head occasionally resting against his jaw, his hand at the small of her back as natural as breathing. They took the back room of the Hutchins house as their own initially, which Mrs. Hutchins arranged with genuine pleasure, converting the sewing room into a proper small bedroom, and moving the overflow work into the front room with a practical efficiency that she made look effortless. It was small and they were in close quarters, and it was, in Caleb's assessment, the finest living arrangement he had known. He continued working at Graves's ranch through the winter. Theodore Graves was a fair employer who paid reliably and valued the quality of Caleb's work with the young horses, and as the months passed, he began talking to Caleb about the possibility of a more permanent arrangement, perhaps a share in the operation over time. It was not land of his own yet, but it was a path towards something, and Caleb assessed it carefully and honestly and decided it was a good path. Winter in Kansas in 1873 was formidable. The cold was a different creature than Texas cold, more serious and more persistent, and the wind across the open prairie was a constant presence, moaning at window casings and reaching under doors with cold fingers. But the Hutchins house was solidly built, the fires adequate, and there was a particular pleasure in winter evenings by the fire that Caleb had never experienced before, having always wintered in bunkhouses or boarding rooms. He and Alara read to each other from the books she had brought from Philadelphia, argued pleasantly about various things including the correct way to make corn bread, played cards with Mrs. Hutchins on Friday evenings, and continued the practice they had begun in October of telling each other true things. He told her about his 12 years of solitude with the benefit of retrospect now, which made them easier to examine, and she listened and sometimes asked small, precise questions that opened things he had not thought to look at. She told him about her mother's last year in ways she had not quite said before, the specific textures of that time, grief and beauty woven together as they tend to be, and he listened with complete attention and said, at one point, "She sounds like someone worth missing," which was the exact right thing to say, and he knew it from the way she looked at him afterward. He found, over the course of that winter, that he was happy. Not in the dramatic, announced way that the word sometimes implies, but in the deep, quiet, structural way, the way a building is sound. It showed in small things. He whistled more. He slept better. He found that difficult situations at work, a horse with a bad attitude, a fence line that needed redoing in frozen ground, were simply difficult situations rather than evidence of a difficult life, because the difficult situation ended and he came home. He had a home. The spring of 1874 came gradually, with the particular tentative quality of Kansas spring, warm days interrupted by cold ones. the grass beginning its long climb back to green, the cottonwoods budding along the creek. Alara told him she was expecting a child in late April, in the early morning, sitting across the breakfast table with her hands around her coffee cup, and a look on her face that he recognized as the look she wore when she was going to say something important, and had decided to say it simply. He set down his own cup and looked at her for a moment and felt something in his chest expand to a size he had not previously accommodated. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing that came out, practical before emotional, which was his nature. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." "Good," he said. And then, because the expansion in his chest required saying something larger, "Alara, that is the best thing I have ever been told in my life." She smiled, and it was the real one, the surprised one, even though she must have known it was coming, as if joy, even expected, can still catch you off guard. He wrote to her father in Abilene that same evening, a short and direct letter in the manner Frederick Voss would respect. "We are expecting a child in November. Mother and father are both well. We look forward to welcoming you as a grandfather." Frederick wrote back within the week, a letter that was shorter and more direct than usual, which Caleb had come to understand as Frederick's way of expressing things he could not quite say at full length. The letter said the news was welcome and that he would come for the birth if his work allowed it. It also said, at the very end, in what looked like an afterthought but was probably the primary thing, "You are a better man than I gave you credit for initially. I am glad Alara has someone worth having." Caleb folded that letter and gave it to Alara and watched her read it and watched her face do something complicated. Grief and relief and love braided together. And he said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and sometimes the most valuable thing is to be present without words. He began, that spring, the process of looking at land. Theodore Graves had a parcel adjacent to his own ranch, about 160 acres along a creek branch, that he would sell at a fair price given Caleb's years of reliable work. The land needed a house and a barn built, which was significant labor and significant cost, but the land itself was good, gently rolling, with adequate water and grass that was some of the best in the county. Caleb walked every acre of it twice in April, in the new green of early spring, and came back to Alara that evening and described it to her in detail. The way the creek bent at the north corner, the stand of cottonwoods along the east line, the slight rise at the south end from which you could see a considerable distance across the prairie. She listened and asked about the soil and the water rights and the condition of the grass through the dry part of the summer, which were the practical questions of a person who had been paying attention to land and seasons for 2 years and knew something about what mattered. When he had answered them all, she said, "What do you feel about it?" "I think it is ours," he said. She nodded once. "Then let's buy it," she said. They bought the land in May, signing the papers at the county land office with the combined savings of Caleb's 12 years of careful putting by and Alara's 2 years of seamstress wages, which together made exactly enough for the land and a start at the materials for a house. He shook Theodore Graves's hand and felt, for the first time in his life, the specific, solid weight of a piece of the earth being his own, not rented, not borrowed, not passed through, theirs. The building of the house became the project of the summer, Caleb doing the primary work himself with help from neighbors who came on Saturdays in the tradition of the frontier, where a house raising is a community project because everyone will eventually need the favor returned. Theodore Graves contributed timber and expertise. 2 young farmers from the edge of town, brothers named Marsh, brought strong backs and steady work. Even Alara's father, who arrived in June for a visit that turned from 1 week to 3, proved useful with a hammer, working alongside Caleb with the concentrated precision he brought to everything, and saying little but working reliably. On the last day of Frederick's extended visit, when the house was framed and roofed if not yet finished inside, he and Caleb sat on the new porch boards in the evening light and looked across the land together, and Frederick said, without preamble, "I was wrong about you." You were working with the information you had at the time, Caleb said. I do not hold it against you. You should, Frederick said briefly, and then said no more about it, and Caleb respected that because it was what honesty looked like in a man who had little practice with it. They shook hands again when Frederick left the next morning, and this time it was the handshake of two men who understand each other well enough to be in each other's company without pretense, which is not a small thing. The house was livable by September of 1874, 1 year after Caleb had ridden into Millhaven in the rain. It was a proper frame house with 2 rooms on the ground floor and a sleeping loft, the whole thing tight and solid, with a good stone fireplace that Caleb had built with particular care, and a porch facing east so they could have their morning coffee watching the sunrise over the open prairie. Elara planted a kitchen garden in the last warm days of September, getting the beds established before the ground hardened, and hung her mother's one surviving piece of embroidered cloth in the front window where the light would catch it. They moved in on a Saturday, and that evening they sat on the east porch as the stars came out, Elara leaning back against him where they sat together on the top porch step, and she had her hands folded over the considerable roundness of her middle, and the night was cool and large and brilliant above them, and he had his arms around her and his chin resting lightly on her hair, and he thought, as clearly as he had ever thought anything, "This is the life I was supposed to be living. I had not known what it looked like until I found it. Do you remember," she said, "what I wrote in that letter about wanting to see the stars from somewhere other than a window?" "I remember every word of that letter," he said. She tilted her head back to look up at him, upside down from this angle which made her smile appear on the underside of her face in a way that was both ridiculous and charming. "We are seeing them from the porch," she said. "Does that count?" "It counts considerably," he said, and then, "It was worth the 3 days of riding." "Was it?" she said, and she knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it. "It was the best decision I have made in my entire life," he said, "and I want to be clear that I do not say things like that lightly." "No," she said softly, "you do not." Their son was born in November of 1874, in the new house on their land, with Mrs. Hutchins attending in the practical capacity of the experienced woman who has helped bring many children into the world, and Caleb waiting in the front room by the fire in a state of alert stillness that was the closest thing to genuine fear he had experienced since his parents' fever. Because she was the center of his world now and had been for more than a year, and the vulnerability of that was real, and he sat with it honestly rather than pretending it away. When Mrs. Hutchins came to the door of the front room and said, "A boy." Both of them fine. Caleb stood up from the chair, and his legs were not quite steady, which he noted with mild surprise and did not attempt to hide. He went in to her. She was pale and tired, and her hair was down, spread across the pillow, and she was looking at the small, red-faced, furious person that Mrs. Hutchins had wrapped in flannel and placed in her arms. And when Caleb came to the bedside and she looked up at him, her face was so open and unguarded and full of something that had no adequate word in any language he knew that he had to look away for a moment and look back, the way you look away from something very bright. "Come and see," she said, and moved the blanket aside a little so he could see the boy's face more clearly, and he crouched beside the bed and looked at his son for the first time and felt the expansion in his chest again, bigger than before, bigger than anything he had a precedent for. "What shall we call him?" she asked. He had thought about this. "Thomas," he said, "for no particular reason except that it is a good solid name and I want him to have a good solid name." "Thomas," she repeated, testing it. "Thomas Hart." She looked at the baby. "Hello, Thomas," she said. Thomas Hart registered no opinion about his name at that moment, being occupied with more immediate concerns, but he had a strong grip, which Caleb discovered when he offered his finger, and the small fingers closed around it with a ferocity that seemed disproportionate to the size of the hand. "He is going to be trouble," Caleb said. "He is going to be wonderful," Elara said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, and she laughed, tired and real, and reached up and took his hand with her free one and held it, and he stayed right there beside her until she slept. Frederick Voss arrived 3 days after Thomas was born, having ridden from Abilene on a hired horse with a speed that suggested he had not waited long after receiving the telegram. He stood at the bedroom door and looked at his daughter and his grandson for a long moment, and Caleb, who had come to stand behind him in the narrow hallway, watched the older man's face do something it was clearly not accustomed to doing. Frederick Voss, practical and contracted and careful with his emotional accounts, looked at his daughter holding his grandson, and something in his face cracked open slightly, just briefly, like earth in a spring thaw, and Caleb looked away to give him the privacy of it. When Frederick held Thomas for the first time, sitting in the chair by the fireplace in the front room while Alara rested, he looked down at the baby with an expression of concentrated attention that was, in its way, very much like Alara's expression when she was thinking through something important. And Caleb understood then where she had gotten it from and felt a complicated softness for the older man that he had not expected. "He looks like his mother did," Frederick said quietly. "She told me she was her mother's daughter," Caleb said. "She is," Frederick said. He looked up from the baby. "You know who was also her mother's daughter, her mother, in all the ways that matters." He looked back down. "I did not appreciate that well enough when I had it. I managed the practical parts and let the other parts pass by." He paused. "Do not do that." "I will not," Caleb said. It was the simplest promise he had ever made, and he meant every syllable. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because no years lived honestly and fully are without difficulty. There were winters when the cattle market dropped and the finances were tight, and Caleb worked extra months with Graves's operation to supplement. There was a dry summer in 1876 when the creek ran low, and the garden suffered, and the grass came in sparse, and they watched the sky anxiously for a full month before the rains finally came in August. There was an illness that took Thomas at age 2 for a frightening week, fever high and unrelenting, that put Caleb and Alara on either side of his small bed in a vigil that said everything important without words, until the fever broke on the 7th night, and Thomas opened his eyes and demanded, in the hoarse, determined voice of a child who had decided to recover, something to eat. There were also ordinary good days beyond counting. Morning coffee on the east porch watching the light spread across the prairie, evenings by the fire with books and conversation, and the comfortable quiet of two people who know each other deeply enough that silence is its own kind of speech. There was the pleasure of Thomas learning to walk, and then to run, and then to insist on accompanying Caleb to the barn to see the horses, where he sat on a fence rail with the same grave attentiveness his mother had, and watched the animals below with a seriousness that made Caleb quietly proud. There was the arrival, in 1877, of a second child, a daughter they named Clara, after Alara's mother, whose full name had been Clara Alara Voss, a naming tradition that Alara had carried forward with a quiet intentionality that Caleb understood was its own form of honoring what had been lost. Clara came into the world considerably less dramatically than Thomas had, arriving in an afternoon while Thomas played in the yard under Mrs. Hutchins's supervision, and was a round, placid baby who seemed from the earliest days to view the world with an expression of calm assessment that Caleb recognized as his own face on a smaller and considerably more endearing version. Alara's sewing work had not stopped when they moved to the ranch. She had continued taking commissions from the women of Millhaven and the surrounding area, doing her work at a table in the front room with the good light from the east window. And as the town grew, which it did steadily through the 1870s as settlers came in waves following the railroad, her work grew with it. She had, by 1876, trained 2 younger women from town to assist her, and what had begun as one woman's skilled labor had become a modest but real enterprise that contributed meaningfully to the household. She ran it with the same directness and precision she brought to everything, fair to her workers, and honest with her customers, and incapable of doing anything less than her best work on any project regardless of size. Caleb watched this with a deep and specific admiration, because he had recognized her capability from the beginning, and there was a particular pleasure in watching a person become more fully what they already were. He said so one evening when the children were in bed, and they were sitting on the porch in the warm late summer air of 1877, the prairie dark and enormous around them, and the stars doing their inexhaustible display overhead. "You built something real," he said. She looked at him sideways, knowing he did not mean the house. "We both did," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I was talking about the business specifically. You started with a needle and thread, and you have 3 women working for you now and orders 3 months out." 2.5 months, she corrected. "That is still remarkable," he said. "You break horses and run cattle on 160 acres, she said. "That is also remarkable." "We are very capable people," he said with a straight face. She laughed, the real one. "We are insufferably capable people," she said. "It is our greatest flaw." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she turned her hand under his and laced their fingers together, and they sat like that looking at the prairie dark and the stars bright and the distant smudge of light that was Millhaven, growing town, their town, the place they had made into home. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I wrote that letter," she said, "and let it go on the wind, I did not believe anything would come of it. I was not writing to anyone. I was just saying it. The way you sometimes have to say a thing out loud or to paper, just to confirm that you are real and your feelings are real and they exist in the world even if no one else knows it." She paused, looking at the dark prairie. "And then you came, with the letter in your pocket, and you had ridden 3 days." She squeezed his hand. "I think about that sometimes. What it means that the wind carried it to you specifically, that you caught it, that you read it and then rode toward it instead of away from it." "I could not have ridden away from it," he said. "I tried to imagine doing that, getting back on Duchess and heading west. I could not make the picture hold." "Why not?" "Because it would have meant pretending I had not heard something that needed to be answered," he said, "and I have never been good at pretending." She turned and looked at him in the starlight, her face familiar and beloved, every line of it known to him now in the way that only years of honest looking can make a face known. "I am glad you are not good at pretending," she said. "I am glad you let the letter go," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the prairie night was warm and enormous around them. And somewhere in the house, Thomas was dreaming in his bed and Clara was making the small sleeping sounds of an infant entirely at peace with the world. And Caleb Hart, who had been alone for 12 years and rootless for all of them, sat on the porch of his own house on his own land, beside the woman he loved with the entirety of his honest and undivided heart, and felt the world to be exactly the size and shape it needed to be. He had ridden 3 days for a letter blown across the Kansas prairie, and what the prairie had given him back, in return for 3 days of riding and 12 years of waiting, was everything. A home, a partner, a family, land under his feet, a name in the community, a life built in the shape of the life he had not known he wanted until he found the woman who showed him, in 200 words on cream-colored paper, exactly what real wanting looks like when it is honest and unashamed. The following spring, when Thomas was 4 and Clara was 8 months old, and the land was green with new grass, and the creek running full and clear from the season's melt, Caleb rebuilt the east porch to be larger, extending it the full width of the house with a roof over it, and a railing along the front, good solid work done in the long pale evenings of April while the light lasted. Ilara came out each evening to watch his progress and bring him coffee, and occasionally hold a board in place when his third hand was required. And Thomas came to sit on the porch edge and throw pebbles into the yard, with the intense concentration of a 4-year-old, who has discovered that things thrown from heights fall down. When the porch was finished, on a Saturday evening with the last of the spring light turning the prairie gold to the west and the first stars appearing in the east, they sat on it together, All four of them. Alara with Clara in her arms and Thomas pressed against Caleb's side with his head leaning against Caleb's arm, and looked at the world in all directions. "It is bigger," Thomas observed, regarding the new porch with proprietary satisfaction. "It is," Caleb agreed. "Why did you make it bigger?" Caleb considered the question honestly, as he considered everything. "Because some things," he said, "are worth expanding to hold properly." Thomas thought about this with the seriousness he brought to all conceptual matters. "Like the barn," he said, "because of more horses." "Something like that," Caleb said. Alara caught his eye over Thomas's head and smiled, and he smiled back. And the evening came down warm and full over their land, over their house, over the east porch that was exactly big enough now for everything they were, and everything they had yet to become. And the prairie stretched away from them in all directions, wide and patient and full of the particular grace of a place that can hold both loneliness and its answer in the same vast, indifferent, beautiful expanse of grass and sky. 2 years later, in the summer of 1879, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 2, and Alara's sewing business had grown enough that she had taken on a proper workspace in town in addition to her home table, and Caleb had expanded the ranch to 240 acres with the purchase of an adjacent parcel from a farmer moving further west, she found him on the porch one evening with a piece of cream-colored paper in his hand. He was reading it. She stopped in the doorway, recognizing the paper, recognizing the way he held it, careful and deliberate, the way you hold something you intend to keep. "I have read that letter perhaps 100 times, he said, without looking up. He knew her step by now the way he knew the land by feel. "Every time I read it I find something new in it." "Like what?" she said, coming out to sit beside him. "Like this," he said, and pointed to a line near the end. He read it aloud. "I think a person ought to be allowed to want one true thing even if the wanting never amounts to anything at all." She was quiet. "You got your one true thing," he said. "I got considerably more than one," she said. He said. "So did I." He folded the letter along its old creases and held it for a moment. "I want to keep this. Is that agreeable to you?" "You have kept it for 6 years," she pointed out. "I have, but it is yours." I wanted to ask properly. She looked at him with that direct, unguarded look that had never in 6 years become less particular or less his. "Keep it," she said. "You earned it. You rode 3 days." He put the letter back into his breast pocket, where it had lived against his heart. From the first moment he had read it on the open prairie in September of 1873 to this evening in the summer of 1879 on the porch of his house with the children inside and the prairie spread open around them, vast and patient and full of wind. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and she said, "I am going to tell you something true." "Tell me," he said. "I have never once in 6 years regretted letting that letter go," she said. "Not for a single morning." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Neither have I," he said. "Regretted catching it." The stars came out above the Kansas prairie, the same stars that had been above it in September of 1873 when a piece of cream-colored paper had blown out of the wide sky and pressed itself against a lone cowboy's chest with all the urgency of an unanswered question. The grass moved in the warm night wind, with the same long silver waves it had always made. Somewhere out on the open ground a coyote called once and was answered, and the night settled back to its ordinary music of wind and grass and the quiet breathing of the land. In the house behind them, Thomas Hart slept hard in his bed, one arm thrown over the edge in the abandon of a boy who trusts the floor to be there. And Clara slept in her small room with her dark hair spread on the pillow and her expression of placid assessment maintained even in sleep. The fire in the front room was banked low, red coals holding steady for morning. The embroidered cloth from Alara's mother hung in the window and caught the starlight. Caleb and Alara sat on the east porch of their house on their land in the full dark of a summer night, and he held her close against the slight cool of the evening air, and she had one hand against his chest where she could feel the letter in his breast pocket, thin as ever, real as ever, and they were quiet together in the way of two people who have built something that can bear the weight of silence, who have been honest with each other for long enough that there is nothing between them that needs managing or maintaining. Only the simple, extraordinary, ongoing fact of being known. The prairie was wide around them, and the stars were bright above them, and they were home.